Okay, so our last and final notes recording, Key Issue 4, Chapter 9, and it's talking about farmers facing economic difficulties, and it's talking about both subsistence and commercial. So follow along with me, fill out anything you need to. We will be meeting again Friday morning and probably again on Thursday for like our Hawk Hour review, which will be for everybody. So let's get started. So one of the questions on your review guide talks about the challenges faced by both subsistence and commercial farmers. So let's talk about subsistence to begin with. First of all, we know that subsistence-based agriculture is going to be conducive of countries that are in the earlier stages of demographic transition. They're less developed, and so therefore their populations are growing more rapidly. Subsistence-based agriculture means that you typically have more kids to help you on the farm. Yet we also know that transfer of medical technology means that there's less deaths, so the population grows rapidly. So one of the problems we see with subsistence agriculture is this idea that you're having to feed an increasing number of people because your population is consistently growing. The other thing we see though is that even if you're a stage 3 or even some stage 2 countries in Africa, that one of the models that their governments are using to help them develop economically is through international trade. These areas have the ability, because of their climate and because of this idea of environmental determinism, they grow foods that people in MDCs want to have and they want to gain access to, but yet don't have the climates conducive enough to do that. And so they can make a lot of money through export crops, whether it's even something as simple as oranges when they're out of season, or things like cassava, which we don't see a lot of. I mean, these can make them a pretty penny. However, that creates its own set of challenges as well, because if the country starts, and this is what this second point shows, if the country starts devoting large amounts of its land to export production and export crops, which are meant to go to MDCs, it means that there is less land devoted to domestic crops. So you kind of see this marriage a lot of times in LDCs between huge amounts of crops being grown for export, but then also at home there being subsistence-based agriculture to feed your family. And so it creates this challenge of making sure you maintain enough agricultural land to feed yourself while also devoting enough agricultural land to make a profit. And so that is another one of the challenges that subsistence agriculture tends to see, especially in LDCs. Commercial agriculture, and this was discussed, I know in the team's meeting on Friday, but commercial farmers are, victims of their own production. The fact that they are so productive that the loss of supply and demand hurt them. The fact that they increase their surplus, which means it decreases demand. And so as a result of that, they end up cutting into their profits because prices go down. Now, governments have a way of dealing with this, which they call subsidies. Subsidies are going to be big when you watch Food Inc. today as well. And a subsidy can do one of two things. It can pay farmers when prices are low. So in other words, give them that gap. If corn is supposed to be $2 and it's down at 1 because of a flood of the market, it's matching that every single time to make sure a farmer has a consistent income. The other thing a subsidy can do is actually, let's see where it is, right here. Governments, if they have too much of something, can pay farmers not to grow crops or to do something different so that you don't have so much excess that it crumbles the economy. It's kind of funny to think about that if you have too much of something, it hurts the economy, and if you have too little of something, it hurts the economy. And so it's kind of this fine balance of finding that equilibrium. The last thing it says is that governments can buy up surplus production and use it to donate to other foreign governments or sell to foreign governments to make a profit off of it as well. So as a result of having these problems, especially in LDCs, there have been a couple of different strategies developed to increase food production. The Green Revolution has done a lot with this, and we'll look at the Green Revolution in a minute. But one of the things it talks about doing is increasing exports from countries with surpluses. So essentially, like the United States makes more food than any country on the planet. So people buying up that to basically increase the distribution of food. If we go back and we think about Unit 2, Esther Bostrup was the one that even said, in cornucopian theory, that population growth is not the problem, that it's the distribution of resources that is the problem. So this would kind of be going back to what she was talking about, and understanding that if you can find ways to equitably distribute this food, and this is again utopian, but equitably distribute this food, that you don't have a food crisis. But we know that that's easier said than done. You look at your next net exporters versus your net importers. It's odd to look at some of these countries around the world. We see China exporting everything, but yet they actually import more food, as does Japan. And so they're dependent on other people for their survival as well. A second thing we see is this expanding agricultural land. Um, the problem with this is that this is pretty much tapped out. That if it can be farmed on, it's farmed on right now. And actually, look at it. It says farmland in some regions is being abandoned for lack of water. Desertification plays into this. We see this in Southern California, that areas that were once devoted to agriculture don't have enough water to supply it anymore. And so what ends up happening is as the land dries out, it turns into these desert-like conditions. And so this is an interesting chart. We see population growth increasing, but agricultural land has actually not. So what do we have to find ways to do? Be more productive. Bosser also discusses this when she talks about subsistence agriculture. And again, she is the ultimate optimist, because she talked about, and I want y'all to go back and look at it in your textbook when they talk about subsistence-based agriculture. But she says, look, having a bunch of kids isn't bad because you got more people to weed the fields. And by weeding the fields and by having more work, you actually increase your crop production, because the weeds that would have killed off that crop, now you have more of it. And so it's a matter of becoming more efficient with your agricultural land is kind of what they're stating. Another thing that they're arguing is this idea of aquaculture or aqua farming. Some people love it, some people hate it. I know that we in our family just, if we buy fish, we don't want it to be farm raised. But that's a preference for us. It doesn't mean we're right, but it does nothing to diminish the fact that aqua farming is a reality, and increasing fish production has been a reality, because these fish can be genetically modified as well. One thing we do know is that overfishing is reality, that as a result of increase in population, that people have started fishing more, especially in the South China Sea and in areas near Thailand and off the coast of Japan, that a lot of those areas have been overfished, and that they don't have the same capacity to be able to feed those people through fish as they once did, because there's just not as much of them. And so if you look at this, it's interesting. World fish consumption, developing country fish consumption, developed country fish consumption. So we see areas that have LDCs, fish consumption has definitely gone up, but not so much in the MDCs. But then you also see, look at the increase in aquaculture recently. This idea of farmed fishing versus capture. And I think that's what you're going to see a trend with, is that maybe this decreases because, number one, there's not as much fish, but two, you're trying to replenish the ocean. So what are you doing? You're going to keep genetically modifying fish, growing them in captivity. It also makes it more efficient, because people don't have to go out and spend hours and hours and hours trying to fish these different waters. Last thing would be increasing productivity, and this is where the Green Revolution came in. One of the things the Green Revolution did, and I know we talk about GMOs a lot, but the first thing it did was increase, yes, new seeds, but also new fertilizers. These new seeds were the GMOs, and they're meant to be resistant. GMOs can be characterized as growing in climates that don't have as much water, or maybe hotter or colder than what they're normally used to. And so the whole idea of the Green Revolution was actually to stop third world hunger, to make things more productive. That's actually not the case, though, and as you watch Food Inc. today, you'll see that these seeds have been taken over by corporations who produce their own stuff, and they almost play God. Like, we've developed this, we own this, we're not going to give it away for free. So the people who can afford it and the countries who can afford it are the ones who benefit from it, not LDCs. And we see some of these ideas with the Green Revolution. Starts in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and biotechnology is still manifesting itself today. The whole purpose of it was, again, to decrease the amount of world hunger. It says increased production of rice, new varieties of wheat and corn, reducing famine. Those are the positive aspects of the Green Revolution and what it was actually meant to do in its infancy. If you remember one person's name, and it's not actually on this screen, remember Norman Borlaug. Actually, it is right there. Norman Borlaug is the father of the Green Revolution. He was actually a Texas A&M professor, and they developed this in some of those different ag industries that he was teaching and working in. So I want to go ahead and shift over now to look at some of, if we have time, we'll come back to these ethical issues, but understanding what sustainable agriculture is. So there was a huge pushback against the Green Revolution, a huge pushback against GMOs, and we've actually seen an uptick in sustainable agriculture, also known as organic farming. Sustainable agriculture is meant to be a way of producing crops that it has three different concepts. It's sensitive to the land, it limits its use of chemicals, and it better integrates crops and livestock. This is a big one here. There's a big misconception out there that organic farming does not use chemicals. No, it just uses less of them, and probably different types of them, but it's very sensitive to the land and tries to integrate the three of these. When you look at a picture of sustainable agriculture, it takes into account three different things: society, the environment, and the economy, and marrying these three together. Society is this idea of creating high quality food, environment being that you are integrating crops and livestock and biodiversity, and that, by integrating crops and livestock, essentially you feed animals who produce fertilizer for you. But then at the same time, we see that doing this costs more money, which is why a lot of people don't eat organic. We don't eat everything organic because it's very expensive. But the idea is that these farmers have to be able to make a profit off of that, because if they don't, it's not sustainable. And so you see society, environment, and then profit integrated together, and that by making a profit, they continue on this lifestyle, which therefore is meant to increase the production of the three. So let's go back to some of these ethical issues real quick. Ethical issues of the Green Revolution has been that, look at this one. This is probably the biggest one. Starvation of many is prevented, but you've also led to higher birth rates and an increase in the natural increase rate. So it's kind of like that idea of medical technology. Do you give medicines to LDCs, increase their natural increase rate, and put a bigger burden on the country? Life expectancy in LDCs has actually increased by 10 years. That's great, but we have to understand the other side of it as well. And again, this is kind of like this idea of ethics in general, that you got to see both sides of the story. That by increasing this production from MDCs, you've actually increased the dependence of LDCs on the MDCs. Wealthy farmers and multinational corporations do well. Small farmers become basically wage laborers. And so it actually says that, are there more at risk today than there have been? We would have to do a study on that to see. And the last thing is, it says the U.S. spends $10 billion a year on farm subsidies. So is that increasing our economy? Is it decreasing our economy? I would say this, and this is my opinion, it's better to have more food than less food. But these are some of the issues that come in place with the Green Revolution, that we have to see the positives and the negatives that go along with it. So that's key issue 4 in a nutshell. Do make sure you go back and read it. There's a lot of information there. And keep answering those review guides. I'll send some stuff out in a day, probably tomorrow, but Wednesday at the latest, kind of talking about review sessions we'll have Thursday. Friday is going to be another, it's going to be a test, but it's not a test that we're going to put in the grade book. It's going to see how well you're doing with this information. So look at the Von Thunen stuff today, get it filled out. We can do some stuff with that tomorrow as well for the analysis. But appreciate you guys listening. Hope y'all have a great week, and we'll talk to you later.